In November 1878, two giants of the English art world faced each other in a London court of law. On one side, the critic and theorist John Ruskin. On the other, a famous American-born painter, James Whistler. The hearing was prompted by Ruskin's condemnation of a Whistler painting. The artist's response was to sue for libel in a showdown that caught the imagination of the London public. Whistler emerged victorious, but it was a short-lived triumph. He was awarded just a quarter of a penny in libel damages, and the cost of the case left him bankrupt. From his earliest years, Whistler longed to live the lifestyle of the bohemian artist. He wanted to move in fashionable circles, enjoy affairs with beautiful women, travel, socialize and secure fame and fortune. By the time of his death at the age of 69, he had achieved his grand ambitions. Whistler's work was steeped in the spirit of his times. He was familiar with realist and English pre-Raphaelite painting, and many of the artists involved in these movements were personal friends. Whistler was also fascinated by the contemporary interest in Japanese art, and he brought Oriental style to his life as well as to his work. But ultimately, he was a true original. His nighttime scenes and his stylized portraits were like nothing ever seen before, and his achievement as a working artist is now fully appreciated.
As an artist, Whistler had many achievements. Above all, I think that he championed the creative freedom of the artist, and he also challenged preconceptions about what is a good painting, that it wasn't about just subject matter, that it was more about an abstract composition of colour and marks on a canvas. So in a sense, he sort of liberated perceptions of paintings. And he took the critics on in their own arena in the press and fought battles there to champion the freedom of the independent artist.
Prior to Whistler, painting tended to be simply something which illustrated stories or illustrated ideas or philosophies or whatever. Whistler realised that painting was a pure visual medium.
He gives you works that are full of elegance, full of visual pleasure. They're very refined, they're very smoothly painted on the whole. They have this sense of tranquility, as though you were going into a world removed from daily life. And perhaps he embodies that idea of art for art's sake better than any other painter of the time.
One of the important things about him is the fact that he could capture a fleeting moment, the moment when a Catherine wheel explodes. As one of his critics said, he could paint air.
James Abbott McNeill Whistler was born on July the 14th, 1834, in Massachusetts, USA. He was the second of 3 children. His mother, Anna, was a devout woman, and his father, George, a civil engineer. In 1843, George was commissioned to work on the construction of a new railway in the Russian city of St. Petersburg. His family accompanied him, and 9-year-old James's troubles had begun. James enjoyed life in St. Petersburg. The family home was comfortable, and the young boy loved to watch the fireworks displays over the River Neva. He also took drawing lessons, and he made 2 long journeys to London, the city that would be his home for much of his adult life. But in 1849, his father died, and his mother decided to return to the United States. Back in America, James enrolled in the famous military academy at West Point. He was a free-spirited, mischievous figure who tended to rebel against authority. 3 years into his training, he was discharged. But his time at West Point was not completely wasted. The curriculum included drawing lessons, at which he excelled. In his early 20s, he became passionate about a recently published book by the author Henry Murger. It described the lives of 4 brilliantly creative young men living a carefree, reckless life as they pursued their artistic dreams. The book was called Scenes from Bohemian Life, and Whistler was hooked. He decided to become a bohemian himself, to live as an artist. And to do this, he would have to move to the city described by Murger as the global center of bohemian life, Paris.
Murger's idea was that the bohemian life was something that all great creative artists went through, and he quoted Villon, Homer, Shakespeare, Molière as having all of them gone through this stage, and that it was important for an artist's development. As far as Whistler was concerned, I think it made him feel that it was all right, so to speak, to be slightly unconventional.
Whistler was very intrigued by Murger's book on Scenes from Bohemian Life, I think largely because it represented a kind of release for him. He came from a rather straight-laced bourgeois background, a very puritanical background, and the image of this gay life in Paris that the Bohemians lived attracted him immensely.
In 1855, when he was 21 years old, James Whistler secured a financial allowance from his mother and left the United States. He would never return to his homeland. Shortly afterwards, he arrived in Paris and launched himself into the bohemian lifestyle that he craved. Like many would-be artists, he studied at the free studio of the academic painter Charles Gleyre. But he was also interested in the contemporary art of the time. In this early canvas, showing the head of a peasant woman, we can detect the influence of a Frenchman who became an inspiration as well as a friend. The founder of realist painting, Gustave Courbet.
Courbet emulated the Dutch painters, particularly Rembrandt, and Whistler himself in his early period copied this style that Courbet had adopted, so that one sees very broad effects and rather dark paintings with strong highlight effects. But curiously, rather than using his ideas, he copied the style. I don't think Whistler was particularly interested in socialism in the way that Courbet was. He was very much more interested in painting per se.
Whistler would have first encountered Courbet's painting when he arrived in Paris in 1855. Key examples of Courbet's work were on display at the Paris Exposition. And I think he particularly responded to the social realist subjects and also the emphasis in the realist movement of working from nature.
Whistler admired Courbet's controversial peasant scenes. He also identified with his deliberate public image as a free-spirited man of the times. But the young American also sought out the greatest art of the past. He studied the old masters of the Louvre and developed a special admiration for the works of the Spanish master Diego Velázquez. But it was the contemporary spirit of realism that is most evident in Whistler's earliest substantial work. A series of etchings depicting ordinary scenes of urban landscapes and the working people who lived there. These prints became known as the French set. Together, they demonstrate the young etcher's enthusiasm for realist subject matter. They also revealed something of Whistler's personal life at the time. This is Finette, a professional can-can dancer and one of the best-known figures in Paris. She was also one of the artist's early mistresses. In 1859, Whistler left Paris to visit his sister and wealthy brother-in-law in London. It was here that he began work on this intriguing painting, showing his sister and her daughter at the piano. Whistler was now 24, and this was the first important canvas of his career.
At the Piano was one of Whistler's first oil paintings, and it's interesting on a number of counts in terms of showing the artist developing. It is a very sophisticated composition. It shows his rich colour sense. We see it in the mixing of the maroons, the browns, the reds, the green, the white. But also for the complexity of the composition, he seems to have been studying optical effects with his brother-in-law Seymour Hayden. And also, though Whistler always denied that content or subject was of interest or merit, it does show his sister-in-law, Deborah Hayden, with her daughter Annie, at Seymour Hayden's home where Whistler lived from time to time during those early years. So it's a domestic genre piece which perhaps has some underlying theme of mourning or recollection of their father, who had died relatively recently. And Deborah was a great pianist, and the piano seems to have been sent by their mother, their widowed mother, to Deborah, perhaps as a memory for her of the times they spent in Russia together with their father.
At the Piano is now recognized as an early Whistler masterpiece. But contemporary reaction to the work was mixed. Gustave Courbet loved it, but the painting was rejected by the 1859 Salon, the official annual exhibition of French art. Whistler reacted in the hasty, tempestuous way that became a characteristic for the rest of his life. He denounced the whole Parisian art establishment and decided to move permanently to London, where he established himself at his sister's home in fashionable Sloane Street. Shortly afterwards, Whistler completed a canvas whose name was as revealing as its composition. This is Harmony in Green and Rose, The Music Room, a title that reveals much about the artist's ambition to identify the art of painting with the art of music.
Whistler wanted people to focus on the pure beauty of his pictures. He didn't want them to be too taken in by the subject. He felt that he wanted them to just look at them at beautiful effects. And this is one of the reasons why he chose musical titles for them. He felt that music was about pure sound. It was about the pure effects of sound. Why couldn't pictures be about pure vision, about pure images?
It started with the paintings which he originally referred to as moonlights. And his patron, Frederick Leyland, suggested that Whistler call one particular one a nocturne rather than a moonlight. And Whistler wrote a letter to him explaining how absolutely delighted he was about this, that he thought it was a wonderful idea and it really irritated the critics, which also gave him pleasure.
Harmony in Green and Rose introduces us to aesthetic concerns that would stay with Whistler throughout his working life. We can also see recurring artistic themes in other images created during the artist's early years in London. Whistler loved the River Thames, and riverside scenes featured in his second collection of etchings, known as the Thames Set. He was fascinated by the bustling life of London's docklands, and his increasing mastery in handling line can be seen in this print showing the Thameside district of Rotherhithe. Despite his dandyish image, Whistler enjoyed socialising among the seamen and workmen of London's docks. For this 1861 canvas, he chose to paint the river traffic at Wapping. The result was this impressive realist image that again gives us a glimpse into the artist's personal life. Here we see Alphonse Le Gros, Whistler's friend from Paris. We also see the red-haired Jo Hefferman, an Irish beauty to whom the artist was romantically attached at the time. We can also see Jo in this 1862 canvas, Symphony in White No. 1. But this is a very different kind of image. Whistler had high regard for a bold development in mid-19th century English painting, the establishment of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, whose members included John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Whistler knew these artists well. Millais had publicly expressed his admiration for At the Piano when it was shown at London's Royal Academy in 1860. But it was Rossetti who became the most significant influence on Whistler. The two men became virtual neighbours when Whistler moved into a house of his own in London's Chelsea. The influence of Rossetti is evident in this memorable canvas.
Symphony in White No. 1 is related to the work of Pre-Raphaelite painters in a number of accounts. And there are these underlying tensions about narrative, though Whistler would have denied this, as to has something just happened, is it about to happen? These underlying sexual overtones of the purity of her dress in relation, say, to the wolfskin on which she stands, her unbound red hair in relation to the single white lily that she is holding.
One of Whistler's friends remarked that Jimmy, that's Whistler, and the Rossetti lot were thick as thieves, and their ideas sparked off one another.
Symphony in White No. 1 is now seen as one of the most significant of Whistler's early works. But as with At the Piano before it, critical reaction was mixed. It was rejected by the Paris Salon of 1863, but that was the year that so many works were turned down that the Emperor Napoleon conceived the famous Salon of the Rejected. This was the exhibition where Manet's Picnic in the Garden caused an outrage. Symphony in White was also widely condemned. But others saw the value of this haunting canvas, including the poet Charles Baudelaire. And the Paris exhibition succeeded in raising Whistler's profile as an artist. But he decided to stay in London, living near Rossetti and enjoying his affair with Jo Hefferman, who also posed for this follow-up painting, Symphony in White No. 2. Here again, we see the artist's skillful handling of the white paint. But we can also identify important new compositional elements. Completed in 1864, this canvas is one of the first Whistler paintings to reveal the influence of the Far East. At the time, fashionable London was obsessed with Oriental art. An 1862 exhibition of Japanese artifacts had been rapturously received, and wealthy people began to acquire art and objects from China and especially Japan. Whistler, like his friend Rossetti, became an avid collector of Chinese blue and white pottery, and he boasted that all the porcelain that can be seen in this 1864 canvas belonged to him personally. This picture from the same year reveals an even more striking interest in the Far East. Entitled Caprice in Silver and Gold, The Golden Screen, the canvas is full of Japanese objects surrounding a kimono-clad woman who may once again be the artist's mistress, Jo. But this is an image quite unlike the symphonies in white. Whistler's enthusiasm for the Japanese prints that we can see here now worked its way into the heart of his compositional technique.
If we look at Whistler's paintings in relation to particularly Japanese prints, we can see straight away how he adopted this method of cutting off the image in strange, rather asymmetrical designs. Sometimes the design being so powerful that it takes a while for you to understand exactly what the image depicts.
It's the way he uses space, sometimes the flattening of the picture plane. He absorbed these influences and went on to produce these marvellous paintings.
The spirit of Japanese art would stay with Whistler throughout his career, and the Oriental influence would also be apparent in paintings whose subject matter could hardly have been more Western. But in the mid-1860s, Whistler was still in touch with his first great contemporary influence, Gustave Courbet. In late 1865, he returned to France to paint alongside Courbet on the coast at Trouville, taking Jo with him. That autumn, Whistler painted a series of enigmatic seascapes, heavily influenced by the French artist. This harmony in blue and silver was especially indebted to an earlier work by the painter who now called himself Whistler's master. In artistic terms, the visit to Trouville was a productive one, but personal problems were now beginning to affect Whistler's private life. His mother had arrived in London in 1863, forcing Jo to find lodgings nearby. In 1865, his brother also arrived, fresh from action as a Confederate surgeon in the American Civil War. It may be that Whistler was unsettled by his brother's war record. Shortly afterwards, he embarked on the most unusual of his many travels. On January the 31st, 1866, accompanied by his brother and a number of Civil War veterans, Whistler sailed from London for the port of Valparaiso in Chile. At the time, Chile and Peru were at war with Spain, and the 31-year-old expatriate American had decided to assist their cause. But Whistler was no war hero. When he eventually arrived at Valparaiso, the Spanish bombarded the town, and the artist fled to the hills, where he stayed until he could secure a passage back to London. Whistler's visit to Chile did result in the creation of some fine seascapes, including this Symphony in Grey and Green, where we see the oriental butterfly motif that the artist now adopted as a signature. But the expedition can still be seen as the irrational decision of a troubled man. Increasingly, Whistler's latent aggression began to surface. On the journey home from Chile, he was detained on board the ship after attacking a fellow traveller. Back in London, he punched his friend Le Gros in the face and pushed his brother-in-law through a window. Sexual jealousy may have contributed to his outbursts. In Chile, Jo had left him for his old friend Courbet, and this striking Courbet image, depicting Jo as a lesbian lover, can hardly have impressed her former lover. Bitter after falling out with Courbet, Whistler reacted against his former enthusiasm for realism. In a letter to his old associate, Fontaine-Latour, he despaired for his art in a phrase that reveals much of the confusion he felt at the time. "Oh, my friend, why did I not study under Ingres?"
That comment comes at a time when he was searching for a style and in some sort of confusion between the Courbet realism that he had so admired and yet his developing philosophy about art for art's sake and decorative painting and seeking a kind of rarefied beauty.
He said that he wanted to express himself in his paintings and be what he called viciously French. Ingres, in a way, was very much more akin to the way that Whistler worked, and his way of understanding how the line worked was very much more in relation to the way that Whistler painted. So he very rapidly moved away from Courbet's ideas and influence and adopted Ingres' way of working.
The late 1860s were a troubled time for Whistler, and for 2 years he exhibited nothing. But his life was not all gloom and doom. He found a new lover, Louisa Fanny Hansen, and she became the mother of his love-child son. He also enjoyed the friendship of Frederick Leyland, a wealthy British ship owner and loyal patron of Whistler's work. As the 1870s dawned, the artist was at the verge of the greatest achievements of his career, though actually creating them would prove a tortuous business. This canvas gives us an insight into Whistler's painfully slow technique. This is Cicely Alexander, the 8-year-old daughter of a London financier. The formal title of the work is Harmony in Grey and Green. But it is intriguing to imagine how the artist maintained a harmonious atmosphere in his studio. No fewer than 70 sittings were required before Whistler was satisfied, and this was not untypical. Throughout his career, he was notorious for rubbing out an entire canvas and starting again. Time and again, Whistler was not afraid to try the patience of his sitters in his pursuit of perfection.
When you look at a picture by Whistler, it looks as though it was done in a moment. It has that elegance about it, and it is often very smoothly painted. And what one forgets is that he would often scrape his canvases down and start again. So the laboriousness doesn't come in him piling the paint on and on again. It doesn't look as though it's a very heavily laboured picture. It's that he's constantly rubbing out and going back again. He wants to get exactly the right effect.
This 1872 picture also took a long time to paint. Here we see the historian Thomas Carlyle in one of Whistler's best-known portraits. Again, many sittings were required before the canvas was completed. It is said that Carlyle grew frustrated, but we can be thankful that he allowed the portraitist to complete this subtly harmonious image. The portrait of Carlyle later earned Whistler a substantial amount of money, as did this painting completed in 1871. This is a portrait of the artist's old mother, though the formal title of the work is Arrangement in Grey and Black No. 1. For many admirers of Whistler's work, it is this single image that represents the greatest achievement of his working life.
Whistler's portrait of his mother is a particularly important painting. It shows such remarkable psychological insight into this very devout Protestant widow, grieving. She'd lost 2 children and her husband. It was an influential painting in that, for example, Thomas Carlyle, when he saw it, said that he was prepared to painted by Whistler. And this was no small decision. One didn't say one would be painted by Whistler lightly because it was such an endurance test.
The picture was bought by Paris, by the Louvre, in 1891. And this was probably the first major official recognition of Whistler as an international painter. And really from that point, honours, price rises in his work and so on come in. So it was critical from that point of view. Though surprisingly, when the picture was first exhibited, it had a rather cool critical reaction. And since Whistler's lifetime, it has become an icon of motherhood throughout the world.
When this image was painted, Whistler was 37 years old, with increasing confidence in his abilities. As this 1872 self-portrait reveals. He continued to enjoy the patronage of Frederick Leyland, whom he depicted in this canvas, completed the following year. Portraiture now took up much of Whistler's time, but he also executed works in an entirely different genre. These were the nighttime scenes of London's River Thames, the nocturnes. Whistler first had this idea of twilight painting during his aborted expedition to Chile, as this eerie image of Valparaiso harbour confirms. But it was in London, by the banks of the River Thames, that he brought this unusual artistic genre to full fruition. As with his portraits, Whistler sought to express the harmony of colour across his canvas, and with images like Nocturne in blue and silver, he succeeded. Once again, the creative process behind images like this was protracted. Before taking his brush to the canvas, Whistler took great pains over the mixing of his pigments. His paint was so diluted that he was compelled to lay the canvas flat on the studio floor. The artist referred to his technique as painting with a source, and the results were among the finest works of his career. When Whistler chose to return to the influence of the Orient in this nocturne, depicting London's Battersea Bridge, his achievement may have been the greatest of all.
Whistler was influenced by a Japanese prince when he was doing his nocturnes, though the way in which it's perhaps rather different is in the type of colour that he's using. He's used an essentially Japanese design, but he's given it a tonality all of his own. And perhaps what is most striking is this idea of making the everyday beautiful, the everyday strange. The nocturnes that he did were scenes of parts of London which were not very beautiful. They were industrial parts. They were down by Battersea and Jersey, lots of warehouses and things like that. And by choosing the right composition, the right time of day, he turns them into poetic reveries.
It's a superb painting. The difference between the rather flat picture plane and the suggestion of space given really by the paintwork. It's also the rather thin paint, I think the very restrained colour harmonies. And one of the interesting things about the picture, I think, is the tiny bit of red which lifts the whole picture, and it's a tour de force.
Images like this are now recognized as masterpieces, but Whistler struggled to find buyers at the time. His early 1870s portraits sold well, however, and he was able to afford a lavish London lifestyle. He found another mistress, Maud Franklin, and his Chelsea home was well known for its parties and other entertainments. Frederick Leyland was also still loyal, but in 1876, Whistler pushed his loyalty too far, and his life took another downturn. That year, Leyland asked Whistler to decorate the dining room of his London home while he travelled north on business. In his absence, Whistler had worked day and night to create an artistic tour de force dominated by peacocks in gold leaf. He had also invited the cream of London's art establishment to admire his efforts. Leyland was furious, and the undoubted genius of the decoration did nothing to calm his rage. The saga of the Peacock Room led to a bitter and permanent breakdown in the artist's relationship with his patron, and worse was to come. Shortly afterwards, Whistler exhibited a number of his works at London's newly opened Grosvenor Gallery. They included this nighttime scene of a firework display. Nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket. The canvas was offered for sale at a price of 200 guineas. It was a sum that one man considered outrageous. The critic John Ruskin. The result was one of the most famous lawsuits of the 19th century. Ruskin was a well-known figure in London's artistic community. His championing of Turner's radical paintings was well known. But Ruskin condemned Whistler's Nocturne as unfinished and said that the artist was asking 200 guineas for the act of flinging a pot of paint into the public's face. The enraged Whistler decided to respond through the courts. He issued a writ for libel against Ruskin, and the case was heard in November 1878 amidst huge interest from the London press and public. The case pitted two different views of the purpose of visual art against each other, and only one side could win.
Really, it was about Ruskin, on the one hand, standing up for subject matter and finish, and Whistler, in the other corner, championing the right to have a different approach to painting, that subject matter was not primary, and also that the artist could charge a fair rate. It wasn't about a day and a half's work, it was about, as he called it, the experience of a lifetime.
When Whistler's victory over Ruskin was confirmed, his sense of vindication must have been strong. But the award of a farthing in damages brought him quickly down to earth. With the costs of the case still to be paid, Whistler was left bankrupt. His home and his many possessions were sold to satisfy his creditors. In the end, it had been a Pyrrhic victory. Not surprisingly, he made up his mind to leave London. He secured a commission for a series of etchings of Venice, and in September 1879 set off for Italy. Away from England, joined by his mistress, Whistler took stock of his circumstances. Like many artists before him, he found inspiration in the Venetian landscape, with this nocturnal image of the lagoon demonstrating his continuing mastery of twilight water scenes. But Whistler created few oil paintings on the Adriatic coast, choosing to concentrate on pastel scenes and the etchings that he had been commissioned to produce. Unusually, he chose to avoid Venice's most famous landmarks for his subject matter. Instead, he sought out the back streets as inspiration for a striking body of graphic work. Though some critics again levelled the accusation of incompleteness, we can now appreciate the innovative approach underpinning Venetian scenes like these.
He wanted actually to show, partly as a response to the lawsuit that he'd just had, that he could draw very precisely and with great economy. And I think that this became a sense within his pictures of the Venetian series that he created.
He brought a very beautiful line to it. He was a marvellous printmaker, Whistler, and these are some of the most elegant effects he produced. Once again, rather like in his nocturnes in London, taking places that might have been seen to be sordid at first, little back streets with tumble-down buildings, and turning them into objects of beauty.
His prints convey an idea of Venice as a living place, which it is. I mean, after all, people lived there, but the grand views of the Grand Canal, one doesn't feel so much that people lived there, whereas in Whistler's prints, it conveys the everyday life of the city to a far greater extent.
Whistler returned to London in November 1880, determined to re-establish himself as a major artistic figure. In the years that followed, he applied his mastery of colour harmony to a series of small paintings depicting the fronts of London shops and houses. But his real ambitions were in portraiture, and with commissions such as this portrait of Lady Meu, he proved that his society connections were still strong. He was now confident enough to work with greater speed without the quality of his work suffering. If anything, portraits like this 1884 depiction of Théodore Duret demonstrate an increasing mastery of dramatic colour contrasts, and there were a number of successful exhibitions of Whistler's work during the 1880s. His work was now appreciated by many contemporaries, including Oscar Wilde, and stories of the two men's conversations were widely published. Whistler was still a dandyish figure, with a distinctive white lock of hair hanging over his forehead. He was now one of the best-known figures in London, and his lifelong ambitions were being fulfilled. In 1888, his personal life brought him more happiness when he married Beatrice Godwin, the subject of this lamp-lit portrait, appropriately titled Harmony in Red. His difficulties of the 1860s and 1870s were now behind him. As well as being a famous man, Whistler was now increasingly well rewarded financially. In 1891, his portrait of Thomas Carlyle was purchased for the huge sum of 1,000 guineas. In the same year, the French state paid 4,000 francs for the portrait of his mother. At times, the artist bemoaned the fact that these riches had not arrived sooner, but the early 1890s can still be seen as the happiest period of his life. In 1892, he was awarded France's Legion of Honor, and shortly afterwards he returned to Paris to set up a new home with Beatrice. He continued to move in bohemian circles. He also began to explore the print medium of lithography and continued to travel whenever he had the chance. In the summer of 1895, he was back in England, staying at the southern resort of Lyme Regis, where he painted this moving child portrait entitled The Little Rose of Lyme Regis. Whistler, now in his early 60s, was still a master of colour harmony. But when he created this enthralling image, he found himself facing another personal disaster which he could do nothing about. His beloved wife had become seriously ill, and the visit to the English coast was made for the sake of her health. But Beatrice was suffering from cancer, and this lithograph, created by her husband in early 1896, reveals the extent of her sickness. She died in May that year, and her husband was devastated. This was the biggest tragedy of Whistler's life, and though he lived for another 7 years, Beatrice's death effectively marks the end of Whistler's great achievements as an artist. He was increasingly afflicted by illness himself, but he continued to travel, and in the first year of the new century, he visited North Africa, hoping that his health would improve. But any benefits were short-lived, and after a final relocation back to London, he died of a heart attack on July the 17th, 1903. It was the end of a remarkable life. From his earliest years, he had sought to be a man of his times, and he succeeded in becoming one of the best-known figures of his age, an artist as famous for his character and lifestyle as for his work. But it is that work that remains with us today. It is through famous images like these that we can still appreciate the achievement of James Whistler.